Hello, and thank you for joining us for Addressing Best Practices. I'm Stephanie from the DataMark team, and I'll be moderating today's presentation. Before we begin, I would like to let everyone know that we are recording this webinar and all attendees have been muted for quality assurance purposes. If you have a question, please use the Q&A section of this platform and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. I'd like to introduce Annie Cahill as the presenter of this webinar, and I will let Annie introduce herself.
Oh, thank you. Hey, everybody, my name's Annie. A lot of you may know me from other webinars, but I am GIS Technical Manager with DataMark. So I really am involved in all of our projects nationwide, some from a technical perspective, but mostly what I do is strategic planning. That's the service that I'm in charge of, as well as running our boundary workshops. So a lot of you may have worked with me, or you may be getting ready to work with me on any of those things that that you contracted with us. So anyway, I'm here to talk to you today about addressing best practices. A little bit about me. I spent almost 16 years in local government. 8 of those as someone managing addressing and road naming. The rest of that time, I was a GIS coordinator in another locality, and I worked extensively with an addressing authority. So I had the pleasure or displeasure of being very involved in address management. So I really hope that we have some good discussion here today. Please feel free to use the chat feature. It is just me presenting today. I think Steph's going to hang on the line here, but if you guys want to talk through anything, you can drop questions in the chat and we can work through those together. And then if we don't get to any questions, then I'll just follow up with you after the fact. So, all right. So for today's agenda, I wanted to talk to you about the history and legacy of addressing, addressing for public safety, best practices, the role of the addressing authority, and of course, the path forward. So we're going to go ahead and get started. And thank you guys again for joining. I really appreciate your time today. I'm super excited to have you guys here. I never thought that we would have this many people register for such an exciting topic. But I'm so glad that y'all are here. So let's have a little quiz. So the first question, addressing is a function of the U.S. Postal Service. Drop that in the chat, true or false? It's a function of the Postal Service. Woo, all right, very good. False, false. Okay, an address can be assigned without there being a structure. Can we assign an address without a structure? True. Y'all are blowing up the chat. Thank you for participating. True, possibly. Yeah. Addressing is critical. It's mission critical to all government functions. True or false? True. Very good. Very good. Subaddressing is not that important to maintain. Somebody said lies. False. Very good. Very good. You guys have passed the test. Thank you for participating in that quiz. And I know that a lot of you might be like, these are kind of duh answers, but you would be super surprised at how many people I work with who really need clarification on these different topics. Let's talk a little bit about the history and legacy of addressing. So addressing as we know it today really originated out of kind of the need to locate people, locate a location or a person. So we would say, hey, I'll meet you at the Fox and Hound or at the pub, or we give directions, turn left at the Windy Mermaid and then right at the Broken Wagon. So all of these kind of different things that we use to describe directions or locations. Go to the building with the pineapple, or I live here in Virginia and everything is apple everything. So go to the building with the big apple in the yard. And we still do this to an extent, right, for those of us who navigate by landmarks. But as time went on, we really saw the need for addressing for things like the census, and then of course for tax collection, because we really needed to give a location a more formalized address, simply for record keeping and of course for collecting money. So now we really associate addresses with point of service. That's how most of us, even somebody like me, when I think of my address, I mean, I'm not really thinking first and foremost public safety. I'm thinking point of service, right? Especially for Amazon. Y'all know who you are out there, the Amazon addicts. I'm one of them. But really, when we think about addressing, we're really thinking about point of service delivery. So we care about our mail. We have to get our mail. We also have to get our pizza, right? So I need you to find my house so I can get my pepperoni and mushroom. Utility services. We need our utilities. Things like school bus pickup, Uber, Lyft, and then of course I'm still using addresses for things like the census. And then you see here at the bottom of the list is public safety. So when I was an addressing authority and we had to change an address, you know, this was kind of like the laundry list that people would give us as excuses about why they couldn't change. Oh, it's my address. How am I going to change my mail, my driver's license, my this, my that? There's all this stuff that's involved, all these expenses, but public safety is always kind of an afterthought. And I mean, as it should be, kind of, because God forbid any of us would need to call 911 to have emergency response to our home or the home of someone we love. But really, at the end of the day, addressing should be for public safety. Okay, and that's what the focus of this conversation needs to be. Yes, you're right. People are so possessive about their address. I have stories, y'all. I told you I have been managing and maintaining addresses for a long time in local government, and now part of my job here at Datamark is I get to be nosy and go into your localities and see how you guys are managing and maintaining addresses. So there's nothing that can surprise me anymore at this point. So legacy systems really, we're really kind of in various states of addressing right now. But really the way that they evolved was, well, I'll tell you for my county, we at one time had 5 different addressing systems in use back in the late 80s, early 90s, okay? And a lot of this originates because you have different boundary changes, you have different grid systems in use, you may have different directionals in place for your street names. A lot of times, you know, we either didn't have an addressing authority, we let people make up their own addresses, or, you know, we didn't have all the necessary information, okay? Before you had CAD, and I'm talking about computer-aided drafting, which is like your engineering, how you can, you know, use CAD to basically draw in, you know, plats and things like that, your cadastral mapping, not computer-aided dispatch, which is for public safety. There's 2 different CADs. But basically, before we had any of that, a lot of times you had paper tax maps, or you had your cadastral data. So oftentimes, those maps had a lot of errors. We did not always have information pertaining to rights of way available to us. So lots of different things happened in these processes where you ended up with a variety of different addressing situations and systems, okay? Also, you did have either a total lack of ordinances or SOPs. And when we say SOPs, we mean the standard operating procedures, which means, okay, I sign an address this way, you'll assign it this way. So we really kind of had a hodgepodge of different things early on, just so people could get that point of service delivery without any real kind of consideration to public safety, okay? So our current state situation really is an extension of how it started, right? We have addressing determined locally for better or worse. Some of you are in better shape than others regarding your addressing. Some of you have some real issues that you're working on getting resolved. Some of you don't even know where to start, and that's totally fine. I understand. A lot of you are using multiple addressing systems still. We still have, not only from the public, but also from some municipalities with whom I've spoken, they still believe that addressing is a function of the post office. I actually spoke with one municipality last year, and they said, yeah, we send people to the post office for their address. And I was floored, but that is still very much happening. A lot of you do not have a system of record for your addressing. You are maybe managing things in different Excel spreadsheets. Maybe you have like a master address book that's been maintained since, 87, and you're just kind of jotting down the number. And then the part that always makes me kind of sad is just the disparity in resources, which really hits me, because I understand that many of you are kind of wearing 3 and 4 different hats. It's hard to be somebody who has to do 3 separate jobs and also address for public safety when you've never really been given the foundation or any support. A lot of you have just kind of inherited your different addressing situations and told, here, do. And I'm sure a lot of you can relate to that. But so we're seeing a lot of this type of thing, and I see a lot of this through strategic planning. So let's talk a little bit about addressing for public safety. So the NENA definition of a dispatchable location, I'm not going to read it to you, but basically any location is a dispatchable location. Okay, I'll just put it out there. Anything can be a dispatchable location. So we need to kind of shift our mind when we're thinking about what is an address and kind of have this in the forefront. Okay. So the whole point of addressing, besides Amazon, besides the post office, besides pizza, we need public safety to be able to find us. That is the most important point about addressing. All right, so you guys need to create a system that's logical and consistent so that you can really support your emergency responders with your addressing. That's the goal, okay? You want to establish rules and guidelines to support that usability, all right? You also want your addressing system to be easy to update and maintain, all right? And you can apply different addressing systems. It's not ideal, but sometimes it just happens, right? Especially if you're in a municipality and you have an annexation. It's not unusual to see different addressing systems within a community. The important part is, how are you maintaining that? How is that being reflected in GIS? And consequently, how is that being fed into your CAD system or whatever systems your emergency responders are using? So there's a few different addressing systems possibilities that we see. Grid system, a lot of you might be familiar with this, but basically what that involves is you're essentially gridding out the community, and those grids are incremented by blocks. Usually the numbers are very large, so you'll see like between 4 and 6 digit numbers being used in a grid system. I often find this within urban areas where you have very compact streets and lots of addressing. We also have distance-based, where the road is essentially incremented. It can be different distances, but it's basically a distance that starts at an origin. Okay, it's either going to be an origin within your community, or it can just be at the beginning of the road, where the road intersects a major road. And then of course you'll have your parity with your even on one side and your odd on the opposite side. And then of course, as I just mentioned, you can have a combination of the two. It's not a one size fits all. A lot of you, like I said, you're coming into this, your systems were put into place in the late 80s, early 90s, and you're just kind of going with the flow and continuing to maintain. And then the last is what I call winging it. And that is a true story. That is a very technical, true term. I'm not going to say I use that in strategic planning when I deliver strategic plans, but I will say that a lot of you guys, you don't have records of your addressing systems. You just don't. Maybe they're in the cave somewhere with the Dead Sea Scrolls. I've seen a lot of your addressing grid maps. They are holding on by Scotch tape and a prayer. They're old, right? They're as old as me, and they're falling apart. And you're just kind of patching them together and kind of trying to preserve them as best you can. But for a lot of you, because maybe your addressing authority has changed throughout your locality, and you've inherited this, you might be missing some maps, etc. That's very common. We see that a lot. And so essentially what y'all are doing is you're going out and you're interpolating the address. You're saying, okay, well, I have an address on the right, an address on the left. This one kind of fits in the middle. We'll just go with it. All right. So we see a lot of that as well. So now that you have a little bit of an understanding of the different addressing systems, let's talk about how actual address points themselves are used within public safety. Now, this is not intended to be a solely kind of like GIS NG911 discussion, but it is really important to understand how this data is being used to support your first responders. Okay, so obviously they're being used in your CAD systems. Now, in public safety, we're talking about computer-aided dispatch, not computer-aided drafting. They can be used in your 911 systems, and then they can also be used in other public safety applications. Okay, now again, in NG911, you are going to have that information being leveraged up front before the call comes into the PSAP. So, you know, and again, this isn't about NG911, but just to kind of drive home the importance of why you need to start giving this some thought as you're going into maintaining your address points for public safety GIS. These are the things that you need to think about. Yeah, so, okay, Jim says GIS was established in my city because no one was paying attention to addresses and it was causing problems. Yes, super common. I mean, you are 100% correct, Jim. There are tons of things like this that we see. The other thing is that we know, as you know, for those of us who are GIS professionals on the call today, that GIS really originated as a planning tool. Okay, it was a tool for planning and zoning, and so consequently, you see the origins of GIS coming out of planning. You also see addressing coming out of planning as well, because some people did use GIS to manage their addresses. Okay, so having planning as your addressing authority kind of opens up another can of worms, and we'll talk about the addressing authority here in just a second. So common addressing challenges, and I'm sure that you guys will drop in the chat your own experiences, but in more rural areas, you have long driveways. A lot of times, you know, especially if you're using a methodology like parcel centroid, you know, and you have a 100-acre parcel, I mean, your driveway could be anywhere, right? Your driveway could be anywhere along that road. And so, you know, if you have long driveways, that may cause some of your addressing to be out of order. Okay, that's very common. How to manage your address ranges. Do I use my actual range or do I use my theoretical range? Meaning, do I take, you know, a road center line and say it's 100 to 199, or do I use the real range, which could be like 100 to 127? That's what I'm talking about. Compact address ranges. So in more urban areas, how do I handle very populated areas where I don't have a lot of infill addressing available? Annexations, those are always tricky because, like I said, that will result in a mix of addressing systems. It might also require a look at, you know, readdressing. So some of you are going through that. Multi-structure addressing and sub-addressing. I will tell you that we are going to spend a little bit of time on this, but that is probably, sub-addressing is the most mismanaged aspect of addressing in local government. I'll just put it out there. It's either not being done, it's being done inconsistently, or flat out there's just a poor job being done of managing those sub-addresses. And a lot of it is through no fault of your own. Okay, it's just something that we notice. And a lot of you, when we're talking through these things, you will bring that to my attention as well as an identified need, right, for more standardization. Lack of public safety engagement. You guys are not engaging public safety with your addressing. Big mistake. And then, of course, the lack of GIS resources. You know, for the GIS people, I don't have to tell you about the value of GIS, or for those of you who are heavy users, right? But you know that GIS can be a tremendous asset for address management. And it can really benefit you in a lot of ways to use GIS to manage those addresses. So let's talk about some best practices. So when we talk about naming roads, I want you all to start maintaining a master road name list, okay? And the reason is because I'm tired of duplicate road names. They are such a problem. They are just problematic, especially when you have duplicates in the same zip code. Okay, you really want to engage public safety in this process and determine if any of the names are going to be an issue. Okay, but the way that you can start mitigating this is by managing a master road name list. So when you have multiple, especially if you're in high development areas, okay, and you could even publish this online. The county where I used to work, we published this online. This was a database that everyone could access so that you can see all of the names that are reserved and their subdivision. Now, there might be other information maintained preliminarily in that, I can't remember, but you definitely want to start maintaining that master road name list. And when somebody comes in and says, hey, I want Elm Street, you say, no, Freddy Krueger, we already have one. So pick another street name, okay? You want to engage public safety. You absolutely, when you get that subdivision plan, when you start getting those requests, engage public safety in that process, okay? When you have multiple structures sharing a right-of-way, I would require a road name. Now, there is an obscure mention, and guys, I'm really trying to get a hold of this resource, okay, so that I can help you guys a little bit better. But there is an obscure mention in the site structure address point informational document to a NENA recommendation where they've said if you have 2 or more structures that share a right-of-way, then you should require a name. Now, at the county where I worked, we would require a name after 3. Sometimes we would allow 4, but that's something that I would definitely consider. And the reason is because you want to make sure that you have plenty of addressing available. Okay, when you start having these long rights of way and you have all these structures that are sharing a long driveway or something, you can run out of addressing very quickly. Okay, and you don't want that. You want to mitigate that. That's part of that risk mitigation. Yes, people are going to complain, okay, but the cool side is that you can kind of implement a process where you allow them to have a say in that road name, okay, within certain boundaries. And yeah, like I said here, when you name a road, yes, okay, thanks, Jeff. I know it's in the NENA guidelines book. I just don't have that available to me, and I'm trying to get my hands on it. So thank you. Naming roads, it prevents an addressing shortage later, okay? So things that you want to avoid duplicates or ones that sound phonetically similar, all right? Don't approve things that sound the same or that are the same. This just creates confusion for your emergency responders. Think about what they're going through. They are dealing with people who are often frantic. They're not thinking clearly. They're not speaking clearly. So don't muddy the water by approving 15 Mulberry streets like I have in a community near me. Avoid abbreviated names, names with punctuation, and don't flame throw me here or whatever you call it, but directionals. Directionals can be extremely confusing. Now, if your community was set up that way, I understand, but avoid this if at all possible, because it can create confusion, like I said. When it comes to addressing, all right, you can and should assign addresses to all structures that are inhabited full or part-time by people, okay? But you also need to be mindful of other areas where people gather, okay? So consider your parks. Consider, like here in my community, we have a park. We have all these different shelter areas that people can rent to have, family reunions and so forth. Those need an address. Horseshoe pits, anything within that park, the RV track, anything like that should have an address. Now, you don't want to over address, okay, but think about it logically from someone who is responding to an emergency. When you have these areas like boat landings or, areas where people could get injured, you definitely want to consider an address for those. Okay. For corner lots, my recommendation is to assign the address based on the front door. Okay. Especially if you're in, well, I call them the cookie cutter subdivisions, where you have little quarter-acre lots and everything is kind of assigned consecutively, because an ambulance, first responder, fire and rescue, first responder, they're not going to go through a garage. They're going to go through your front door. Consider your future development. Get with your planning department, look at your future development plans, understand the need. Okay, understand where you're going to have the areas with the most potential for development. Most of your communities are going to have this in the planning department. All right. And then obviously I want you to start managing your sub-addresses. Okay. Address a house with the front door facing one street on an alley. Yeah, it would go based on the front door. Actually, that's my opinion. I would assign it based on the front door. Yeah. And for those of you who are naming private drives, I mean, we didn't care here locally. I mean, if it was a public, a private, you know, we would always have that requirement about the 3 or more that share a right of way. I know a lot of people are allowing citizens to request their own private driveway name or whatever to make it an official street name. That's fine. But again, document that in your master and don't duplicate that name further on down the road, and don't allow that person to pick a name that's already in use. Yeah, Sean, you assign based on the access point, which may be driveways. And yeah, and so here in my community, we did, if the driveway was 50 feet or greater from the front of the road, then we would assign based on the driveway, or I'm sorry, if the front door was 50 feet or greater from the front of the road, then we would assign based on the driveway. But if it was less than 50 feet, it would just be based on the front door. And all of that is going to should be within your ordinances and SOPs. Okay. And I see that there's more chats going on, but I don't want to get too caught up because I don't want to run out of time. Definitely manage sub-addresses. Okay. It only helps your first responders. So things that you want to avoid: street numbers longer than 6 characters. Again, when someone's frantic, they're dialing 911. The more characters, the harder it is to remember and communicate. Fractional addresses you want to avoid. The city in which I live and where I worked for 7 years, we use fractionals because the city's 300 years old, okay, almost. So we didn't have a whole lot of extra addressing. So often we were using fractionals, but as a best practice, don't do that. Do as I say, not as I do, right? Alphanumerics, you want to avoid that. And then also hyphenated addresses as well. People will still write, 127-7, something like that. But you want to avoid that as a best practice, because that's not how you would actually manage that within your GIS or within the NINA data model. You're not going to be using hyphens there. So when we talk about managing data in GIS, and again, this isn't meant to be like a super uber GIS-y discussion, but the one thing that I would strongly encourage you to do is to make sure that the geometry and the attributes reflect what's going on in the real world, guys. You want to make sure that what's in the real world is what's in your GIS. So a lot of this is going to involve, especially if you're not close to the planning department or someone who is approving that type of thing, you need to find some way to get this information to you in a timely fashion so that you can get it into the GIS. You don't want stuff that's a new construction hanging out in perpetuity and you don't have it in your GIS. What if you have a total reconfiguration of like a major intersection and you're not getting that until 4 or 5 months later? No, you want to make sure that you're getting that as soon as possible so that you can get that into your GIS and consequently to your first responders. With regard to managing your attributes, you want to make sure that you're parsing your street elements into separate fields. And for the non-GIS folks on the call, parsing means that you're just taking a whole and you're breaking it apart. So North Green Street would not be concatenated into one field. It would actually be managed in 3 separate fields. Okay, and there is definitely guidance out there. If you need some help with that, I can send you some information, send you some links. It's all available. You want to make sure that you're splitting and snapping your road center lines at intersections and at boundaries. Okay, if you look at the NENA data model and you see the community information that's stored within that data model, anytime you have a boundary change or an attribute change, you want to make sure that's reflected in your road center lines. Okay. Now I know a lot of you are like, ugh, and I know it's not fun. Okay, but you have to understand that your road center lines, your boundaries, and your addresses in NG 911 should all reflect the same information. Okay, so that's what you want to do. You want to make sure that you're reflecting the same information within your road center lines as it crosses over those different boundaries. Digitize your streets in the direction of travel. And then avoid paper streets in your master, okay? Your master address or your master road center line file is not the place for your paper streets. Manage those in a separate database, okay? And what I mean by paper streets are streets that are not, they don't exist, but they're platted. They may or may not exist, okay? A lot of people are still managing those within their master. That's not the place because again, you know, especially when you talk about like a routable data set, you can't route on something that doesn't exist. So move that to a separate data set, all right? Now for address points, again, want to make sure that, you know, the geometry and the attributes are reflecting what's in the real world, okay? We do have a discussion about accuracy versus precision, and that can be a whole separate topic in and of itself, but we also want to see you parse your address elements into separate fields so you won't concatenate the entire address into one field for management going forward. You're going to have, you know, 127 North Green Street, apartment 12. Use consistent placement methodology. Use consistent placement methodology. I will tell you that a lot of what we're going to be talking about here in the next few slides are directly pulled out of the NENA informational document, which is the Development of Site Structure Address Point GIS data. The phrase that I can use to describe this information, it's an informational document, not a standard. Okay, a standard is one thing, an informational document is another. What I can tell you about this document is that it allows for possibilities. All right. It does give you a lot of grace depending on your situation, all right? And space to make the best decisions based on the resources that you have available. You don't want to let perfection be the enemy of the good here, all right? So the document really takes the stance of, well, something is better than nothing, okay? So if you have, you know, if you're assigning based on parcel centroid and that's all you've got, well then, you know, that's good enough for right now, okay? But you should always strive for that precision, okay, especially for NG 911. And then, of course, to manage your sub-addresses, that's very, very important. So when we talk about placement methodologies, there are different things that you can do, and I'm sure a lot of you are already aware of how addresses are being placed within your community. A lot of you are geocoding, where you're basically assigning an address based off of the approximate location along a road center line. Some of you are using parcel centroid. Some of you are using the site, which doesn't really have any clearly defined boundaries. So things like a baseball field or a campsite, something like that. You might just kind of be ballparking it there, no pun intended. You might also be using structure, which is ideal. And then some of you might actually be assigning and maintaining at the property access, okay? And so the graphic here is a really good example of accuracy versus precision. So, you know, it's accurate to say, yes, every single parcel, which would be each green block, every single parcel has an address. That's accurate to say. But precision is saying every single structure on this parcel has an address, and this address location further defines where that structure is located, okay? Now, this chart was pulled directly from that informational document, and really one stone R is kind of like least and 3 is best. So you can see how the different methods of address point placement are ranked for different public safety applications. All right, so the one I want to focus on is the NG911 because that's obviously what we do. But notice that structure placement is the most accurate and precise for NG911. But notice that it's the least for vehicle routing. So what I would encourage you to do if you're in a rural area is maintain a separate file for property access. If you have really big parcels, several acres, maybe these have, you know, different access points, maybe some of them are gated, you should maintain that. You should maintain that and pass that on to your emergency responders. That's really good information to know. Okay, but I did want to go over this with you because this, again, is in that informational document. It's not a standard, but this does provide a little bit of perspective about how the different methods of address point placement affect these different public safety applications. Sub-addressing, again, I did choose to spend some time on this because this is the one that I get the most emails about. This is also the most mismanaged as it pertains to local government addressing. Y'all know what sub-addressing is, right? You have these properties or these different areas that have multiple structures. How do we handle that? How do we handle you know, a storage unit or a school or college campus? I get lots and lots of questions about this, okay? So some of the challenges that you can face with sub-addressing for the addressing authority, number one, inconsistent addressing all around. You know, is it unit? Is it apartment? Is it, what is it? Availability of addressing. Okay, if you've run out of addresses, how do you handle that? Record maintenance. How are you maintaining this information? Especially if you're not a GIS user, because consider this, guys, not everyone who manages addresses work with GIS at all. You'd be surprised. A lot of people with whom I work on strategic planning, their addressing authority does not use or access GIS at all. So that makes things interesting. Support in your ordinances. Do you have any documented direction? Do you have anything defined for you that can help you? The question of can you or should you assign individual addresses versus using a sub-address? And then, of course, that entire workflow process and how that information gets communicated out to others. For the GIS folks, obviously the placement method is a challenge. How do we place our sub-addresses? What's the best way to do that? Managing the level of detail. In the NINA data model, it does allow you to manage down to the seat level, okay? I never recommend that. I always recommend take it to the floor, and you know, if you can get, you know, like an individual unit number, that's great, but have a plan going forward. If you plan to go into that level of detail, you absolutely have to have a plan going forward, okay? And then, of course, data quality issues. How do you manage that going forward? What does that look like when you have consolidations? From the public safety perspective, you can imagine that sub-addressing can create a nightmare. Signage is a huge issue. Not, you know, an apartment, a mysterious apartment that has just been, you know, added, and there's no signage indicating that location or entrance. You also deal with delayed response time, consequently, because they can't find it. If they can't find it, that's going to delay. Even seconds can cost lives. And then we also, through the strategic planning process, really learn about the forcing addresses issue. When you have a lot of addresses being forced in the CAD system, that is a good indication that you're missing information, okay? So some examples, and again, these are pulled directly out of the informational document. I hate this entire thing because you have a duplicate street name. So that's number one that I wouldn't do. But again, in the informational document, it does allow for different possibilities, okay? It does allow you to assign an address, a single address for a group of 4 structures. but just because you can doesn't mean you should. If you look at that chart that I posted previously, you can see that structure placement is extremely important. Okay, so the example on the right is a little bit better. You could call all of them 100 conifer circle, but you would need some sub-addressing there. So you would need to define building 1 through 4. My preference would be it needs an individual address. There's no reason why you couldn't. You have a street name there. Why wouldn't you just give it an individual address? Makes sense. For a business, this is really common. So a lot of you will just assign one for multiple structures, or you can assign 3 individuals, again, with building numbers and keep it 170, which is probably what I would do in this situation. Now, if it continued to expand and you had, all of those structures sharing that right of way, you may consider giving it another name. Mobile home parks are huge, and I get a lot of questions about mobile home parks. A lot of this, guys, is really going to be determined by your local ordinance. Okay, how you handle these different scenarios. Yes, use the informational document to guide you in these different situations, but at the end of the day, it should come from your ordinance. Okay, for me, this is a no-brainer. This is individual street names with individual addresses for each one, okay? Because in my county, my ordinance says if you have 3 or more structures that share a right-of-way, it gets named. Well, looky here. We have like a billion that are sharing one right-of-way. So that right-of-way should have a name with individual addressing assigned off of that, okay? Apartment complexes, for me, it's the same situation. Am I seeing correctly in the business example, placing the address number on different buildings? Yeah, so Tammy, what happens with that, and again, this is from the informational document, what you can do is you can call each one 170 with individual building numbers. You do have space for that in the data model. The addresses have to be unique. So if you're going to go for sub-addressing, they have to be unique. You can't have 3 of them in here that say 170. You have to differentiate them somehow. Okay, so you can either do that by assigning a building number or by giving them an individual number. I hope that answers the question. And I'm sorry if I'm missing chats. I see you guys are really talking, which is great, but I want to make sure we can get through all of this. Apartment complex is the same. I don't see any reason why you would have 2,500 and assign 10 building numbers. Give them each an individual address. That's all that you need to do. Business park, same situation. We've even had business parks where we've made them name the road because there's just too many different structures and sub-addresses in there that are sharing, they're sharing addressing and you can run out. So you have to be very mindful of that. And again, these examples specifically can be found in the NENA informational document. I know that it's a little bit disappointing to say, no, you can't do this, but you have to understand that a lot of us are in different phases of readiness and we have different resources available to us. So what the working group did was they came through and really tried to give that some consideration and be mindful of the fact that we're all in a different phase. And again, not to let perfection be the enemy of the good. Yeah, my preference would be that you're going to give each one of these buildings an individual building number, maybe name a street or 2, but not everyone can do that because of their resources. A lot of you are working, really hard and doing the job of 3 or 4 different people, so we don't want to add stress to your plate, especially dealing with, business owners and trying to change people's addresses. We know that can get kind of tricky. A university or college campus, to me, where you have areas that are what I would consider sensitive populations, nursing homes, schools, daycare centers, college campuses, where you might have a lot of underage drinking going on, this to me would be high priority. I think that I would prioritize getting those addresses individualized in there. That would be my preference. That would be my recommendation. So let's talk about the addressing authority. So really, you're going to regionalize your approach and how you assign numbers, okay? And you're going to standardize what you're doing as much as possible. Ideally, I would like to see all of you who are addressing authorities have some type of committee or at least communication with the different stakeholders that are involved. I want to see you working with your public safety people. I want to see you working with planning and zoning, with public works, with your utility providers, anyone who is actively involved with your addressing, especially public safety guys. They're consuming your data. You have to make sure that the data is working for them. Sometimes that involves public safety addressing education. I will tell you, a lot of people out there are addressing authorities who should not be. I'm just going to put it out there. I don't often recommend changing addressing authorities, but sometimes it's necessary because people are not following best practices. And, you know, I mean, you could let these things linger in perpetuity, or you can deal with them and resolve them. And one of the ways that you do that is you educate. And you say, okay, planning and zoning, I'm just picking on planning, no particular reason. But if you're going to assign an address based on planning needs, I want you to consider public safety needs, and this is what you need to do, okay, going forward. And a lot of that is going to come with your addressing ordinances and your SOPs. A lot of you don't know if you have an ordinance, or you've never seen it, or maybe the last time you saw it was when it was created, when E911 went into effect, which for a lot of us was in the 90s. The ordinances are incredibly important because that's really what's going to give you your backbone. That's the backbone for the addressing authority. It establishes who the authority is. It also establishes the different requirements for addressing and road naming, and then it also will establish your basically your resolution process when you have a violation, okay? And you want to make sure also that you're getting support for these ordinances. I mean, an ordinance is only as good as the support, right? And then, of course, your SOPs. You want to make sure that you are documenting these procedures that you're using to assign addresses and road names and things of that nature. So I just kind of talked about this, but yeah, review and revise your addressing ordinance. A lot of things that are in our old addressing ordinances are old hat and they don't apply anymore. So it would really be beneficial to review that as part of the strategic planning process. That's something that we review in depth with people, and we make suggestions for revision based on, you know, best practices for NG911. But your ordinance in general should establish the authority and who has the responsibility for assigning the addressing. Any requirements, signage is incredibly important, okay, establishing the signage, and then your enforcement process, okay, so what are you going to do when somebody doesn't listen to you, okay? The SOPs, again, you want to document that process. If it's someone's responsibility in planning to pass you the plats and the subdivision plans, then you need to document that. Document that in your SOPs. Document your assignment process. Again, if y'all are using those old papyrus addressing grids or whatever, and you don't have them geo-referenced, you know, document that. Also, your communication process. One of the things I highly recommend, in addition to that master address list, is a public repository for all of your addresses. A lot of you are struggling with keeping people updated, not only the business or the property owner, but also different agencies like FedEx, you know, the post office, utility companies. This could be something that your IT department can assist you with. You can have those addresses that are new pulled out nightly and posted in a public repository that you can access on the web. That way, you don't have to send out individual address letters to people. You just throw them the link and say, hey, check this, you know, once or twice a week. All the new stuff is going to be out there. That way, it takes it off of you. It's an automated process. I would love to see you guys getting into that. That would be super beneficial for a lot of you. So the path forward. We want to mitigate our risks. Okay, that is extremely important. Is to be proactive and not reactive with addressing. it's incredibly important, because once you have somebody established at an address and you go to try to correct that, it's difficult. If any of you have ever tried to resolve an address, it's really tough. You want to make sure that you're using, obviously, the best practices for addressing and road center lines, using the things that we've already talked about, managing your data in a way that is conducive to NG911 and to our first responders, and then creating a QA culture. And the way that we do that is by enforcing our best practices. If you receive an address from planning and zoning and you run that by your public safety, or if you're checking it and you see that something isn't right, you bring it back and you say, hey, what's up with this? Why did you give it this address? Or, hey, this needs to be sub-addressed. Those are all things that you should be checking on. There should be a system of checks and balances in place throughout the entire process. You want to make sure that you're engaging your different stakeholders, okay? Identify who your stakeholders are in the process, because I can guarantee you the way that the data is managed is going to be based on the business need, okay? If your public works department is managing and maintaining your road center lines, they're probably not really concerned with public safety best practices. The same with planning and zoning. I can tell you that was a personal experience I had where, you know, addresses were assigned for planning business needs and public safety was kind of an afterthought, and it's really unfortunate. But if I were working with you on a strategic plan and we had that situation where we could prove time and time again that addresses were not being assigned with public safety in mind, then I would make a recommendation to switch that addressing authority, okay? And don't be afraid to bring that to your administration. If you have real concerns, if you're a public safety person and you're seeing real issues with the way that addresses are being assigned, you need to raise that concern. That's a really big deal. You want to make sure that you are doing iterative validations on your GIS data. When you manage and maintain your address points and your road center lines for NG911, you want to validate that data and make sure that it is good to go, okay? And it should be a continued process. Strategic planning, shameless plug for myself and for all of us involved in strategic planning. Your process is, you want to have clearly defined goals. You obviously want to collaborate. You know, NG911 requires bringing more stakeholders to the table. Okay, it's beyond, you know, just your public safety. It's pretty much everybody who's involved in that addressing and road center line workflow. So you could potentially be pulling in a lot of different departments. Communication is incredibly important. And then again, education. People don't know what they don't know, and you have to educate them. The strategic planning process, the whole thing really from start to finish is self-explanatory, I think. But you want to identify your stakeholders and gather information. Some people will accomplish this with a survey. I just go in and have discussions with folks. If you've worked with me on your plan before, you all know how I am. I go in and I ask the same question 10 different ways, and I kind of poke the bear a little bit, and it's a little bit of fun for me, but I really do enjoy the strategic planning process. We will do a needs assessment and a gap analysis on your GIS data to determine where your deficiencies are. And a lot of you will already know your deficiencies, either within your workflow or your communication. It's going to be, you know, very self-explanatory in that process on your side. You know where your issues are. A lot of times you just need a vendor to come in and kind of, you know, shed some light on other things that you may not have known were a problem, or help you identify why certain things are a problem, and then also give you the next steps to help you fix those things. All right. Whew. I think we finished with, what, 6 minutes? So I will take any questions you have.
All right, Annie, it looks like we have quite a few in the Q&A section. Do you want me to read those off to you? Okay. All right, so first of all, we have Tara. She says, I am the address coordinator for Sarasota County, and we have gotten several subdivisions lately with alley access to townhomes. The front door is accessed by open space only. Can you tell me a best practice for assigning addresses to this type of subdivision?
For that one, you could use the alley access. I would say that signage here is going to be critical. I would definitely give some strong consideration to your signage if you're going to assign it based on the alley. Of course, without seeing the plan, it's a little bit tough. But that would be my recommendation, especially if, an emergency responder can't get to the location through that open space.
Should remote
Okay.
rural roads without adjacent development, no address range be included in RCL layers?
Yeah, I mean, if it's part of the road center line and it's traversable by an emergency responder and you want to include that as part of a routable data set, then yes, I would. Now, as far as like your driveways and your access points and things like that, you can maintain that in a separate data set. That would be, especially if you're in a rural area where you have those really long driveways or you have multiple driveways into one property, that would be preferable, is to manage that and pass that on.
So Kyle asks, how do addressing authorities best share local authoritative road data, GIS format with commercial map and delivery services, Google Maps, GPS, etc.?
Oh, Kyle, the $1 million question. Yeah, so it's always problematic sharing that data. I have a couple of contacts that I can try to find and share. A lot of it is who you know. I think that public repository can go a long way in helping all of your agencies. Anyone who would visit that website could have access to that. But at one time, I did have a contact for Apple Maps and Google Maps. So I can try to find that.
Okay, and it looks like somebody sent us that document in the chat. All right. Jason Danielson says, hi, Annie. Thanks for the great presentation. How would you recommend addressing for the following? Commercial structure on a corner lot with multiple accesses / front doors to businesses on each street, single address with units / structures with GIS points placed at the respective entrance, or individual house numbers assigned from the respective road. Our fire department appreciates a single address with units, which helps to identify that they're responding to a location with multiple businesses. When the fire department responds, they immediately confirm the address associated with the Knox box, keys for each business. A single address assists with this restriction. Thank you.
Yeah, Jason. So this is one where, as you can see, you can do this in a number of different ways. And I think that you are already kind of ahead of the game because you're doing what you should be doing. You're consulting your fire department. And I would always defer to their preference and what makes it easy for them. So I think you're doing well there. I would do a single. My preference is always a single when possible, especially if you have the addressing available and you don't need an extra street name. I would do a single with units or suites within.
Does Datamark have an addressing best practices document, or is one in the works with an emphasis on public safety?
It's me. I am the document. We do not, but if there is a desire for like a white paper or something, I would strongly encourage you guys to really take a look at that informational document. And again, the point of that is to allow for possibilities. So I would recommend that. It's a big document, but bear in mind that if you are looking at this from an NG911 perspective, structure placement is going to be the best methodology. And so with that being said, use the information available to you to assign addresses based on the structure and not a parcel centroid. If you're currently maintaining with parcel centroid, then I would say that could be a goal for you, right? Is once you get those resources, go out and start moving those points. start rectifying those using your aerial imagery or whatever you have available to you. Start moving those onto your structures and seeing how you can work toward a structure-based address management placement management.
Beth is wondering, what is the best way to handle street segment IDs where splits occur?
Wait, say that again. Oh,
What?
street segment IDs were.
Yep.
Well, so from an NG 911 perspective, you're going to have an individual. You're going to have an NGU ID. An NGU ID is the NENA globally unique ID. It's globally unique. Globally unique, meaning at a nationwide level, it is unique. Okay, and there's, I know we're at time right now, but I'll tell you the NGU ID, the purpose of that is for error reporting, because I'm in Frederick County, Virginia. There's also Frederick County, Maryland, 45 minutes up the road from me. Okay, if we both have main streets and something gets reported out of the EZNet, the NGU ID helps to differentiate between those segments. Okay, it's saying, okay, well, this is the main street in Virginia, Frederick County, Virginia. This is the main street in Frederick County, Maryland. So you're going to have an NGU ID anyway. Every single record within your attribute table should have an individual and unique ID. And we can talk about that another time, or if you want to email me or something, that's fine too.
Kyle is wondering, does the USPS address database include roads that are not along their delivery routes? Rural roads with no mail delivery?
I really don't know. What I can tell you about the USPS is, just in working with them for as long as I have, their carriers carry this, what's called a red book. And by law, if they know where it goes, they have to deliver it. So beyond that, I'm not too sure. I mean, we had a good relationship with the headquarters in Merrifield, Virginia. And we had, toward the end of my employment at the county, we had kind of started this flow of information. So I'm not entirely sure if they do. I mean, I would say if someone's receiving mail, that would dictate what goes in their database. I don't know that they are maintaining data that's not mail related, but I could try to research that. Ravi, I did know someone at Google Maps a long time ago. I can see if I still have that contact.
All right, and Lori is wondering, or Lori asks, we're seeing ADUs being built off the alley without any address to the frontage road that the main house is addressed off of. What do you suggest we do for addressing of those ADUs?
I would have to see a plan for more information. It sounds like there's a home with the main address, and then an ADU would be attached to the main house, correct? So, I mean, I would say that would just be, a sub address off of the main, but, also you would want to include that information within your GIS as well. So remember, in public safety, we talked about this idea of packing the record, which means that you're putting as much information into your GIS as possible, because all that does is further help the emergency responders.
Paul
okay,
is
what else?
asking, does NENA addressing template have a column to manage, say, gate codes or lot combinations for long driveways in rural regions? If not, how have you seen such personal information managed?
Not within the road center lines data model, because that is specific to roads. But I would highly recommend, if you have a lot of those situations, that you would maintain a separate file for those long driveways or those rights of way access points. And again, pack that record, put all of that information in there that you can.
Adrielle is wondering, I've had a couple of instances where our fire department will request that I work on changing existing sub addresses to serve their emergency response standards. I find that this can be a tricky effort to coordinate between building owner, tenant, and USPS. It results in two different sets of addresses to maintain, not to mention that some parties are very resistant to changing their addresses. Do you have any recommendations for how to manage this type of change?
Yes, I would make sure that you have a solid ordinance and that you give people time to change. We used to send certified letters, and then I think on like the second or third letter, we would issue a citation. I mean, we didn't really mess around in the county where I worked, but you know, it is important. I think what you want to do is preface it with the public safety message. The messaging is really, really important when you guys go through any type of readdressing effort. I mean, we have someone with whom we work, and they're not a client of ours, but it's just someone that we talk to. And they went through a big part of their community, and they did a readdressing effort. And it was all in the messaging. It was largely successful, and it was because of the messaging that it was successful. So that's really, really important. And then fall back on those addressing ordinances, guys. I know it can be super scary. No one likes to go after their citizens, but at the end of the day, if you have areas where especially you've had a lot of problems, you know, you really do need to get it resolved. Sometimes it takes using a heavy hand.
All right, awesome. And then some people are wondering if they will receive a copy of the presentation. Yes, we have recorded this presentation, and I will be sending out the link to all registered attendees within the next couple of days. So look out for that right around Thursday morning. And it'll be coming from info@datamarkgis.com, just so you guys are aware. Robbie is wondering, do you provide assistance in sub-addressing to pipeline companies in the pipeline integrity management?
If you would like assistance from Datamark, just reach out. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but I mean, an address is an address, you know what I'm saying? So that's how we approach it from a public safety perspective. So if you need assistance, then reach out and we can see if we can work with you.
All right, and Tara's wondering, I'm trying to name a street address that stops and starts throughout the subdivision. Do you maintain one name or unique names for each segment?
Well, that again would be determined by your ordinance. So in the county where I worked, we would request a new name at a major four-way intersection. But this is not, you know, again, it's local, right? It's based on your local practices. It needs a local unique ID. You can keep the same name, but if it makes sense to change the name, I don't see any issue with that. It really just depends on those local best practices.
Okay, and then it looks like we are down to the last question. So this is another one from Robbie. Is 811 addressing different for underground pipelines?
That is a really cool question, and I need to look that up. Not to my knowledge, but I believe that there would be a higher level of like coordinate management when we're talking about underground utilities. And that's definitely something, Robbie, that I would like to look into. So thanks for that question. I'm going to write that down.
Awesome. And then I will go ahead and put our general Datamark contact information in the chat, just so that if you guys have any additional questions, you can reach out to us independently. All right, and thank you guys so much for joining us today. We will be sending out the recording in a couple of days.
All right, thank you guys so much for your time. I know we went a little over, but I do appreciate your time. Thanks for hanging out with me this afternoon. And if you have any questions and you want to get super nerdy with addressing, just email me and we can talk.